Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video. Today I'm here with my roommate Sophie, and we're gonna talk about poems. A little while ago, for some reason, y'all started requesting that I make a video about poetry. For some reason, like, you think I know about that. But luckily, my roommate is the world's leading expert.
I don't even know that I'm the apartment's leading expert, but...
I'm not the apartment's leading expert. I've written like 3 poems and maybe one of them is good. So we're gonna just chat about some poems in a vaguely structured manner. Yes, we have the exact same haircut.
That's my fault. That's on me. I did a quarantine haircut.
So yeah, Sophie and I went through the same writing cohort. We've been workshopping each other's stuff for like, I don't know, like 3-4 years.
A long time.
We also workshop each other's tweets.
Colleagues in all ways, really.
Colleagues in not knowing anything. Because Sophie is a poet and has published poems, and I believe she knows what she's talking about, even though she'll say that she doesn't.
It's true.
We're gonna chat about poems, and mostly she's gonna say things because I don't really know what I'm talking about. I've been writing poetry for like 1 year, and I'm a baby, so
I feel that.
I've drafted some questions. The first one is just, what is your process for writing a poem?
I think you've said this before when we've talked about poetry too. It's like often just a line will come to mind and then you're like, that line is really good. I need to put it somewhere. But for whatever reason, it doesn't really work in fiction. And so I kind of need to put it in a poem. And usually I find when it doesn't work in fiction tends to be when you really like can't think of a way to shoehorn it into a story. If a character said it, you'd be a little bit like, that's a really like strange way to talk, because often I feel like poetry, like the language tends to get inverted sometimes, or you'll be talking about a concept where like no conversation is gonna really lead to that point, which is what's cool about poetry, but it's also like what makes it sometimes not compatible with certain parts of fiction, even though I think writing poetry and writing fiction, or writing any 2 genres, can be like really awesome cross-training, of course, because we both do both and it's great.
It's true. She does both, I kind of do one.
Or you just come up with a premise and for whatever reason, this sounds like I write poetry completely by process of elimination, which is honestly kind of true, but it is like, you'll be like, okay, this is an interesting idea, and then you realize it isn't a short story, and it isn't a novel, maybe it's a poem. I
like how the poem is like last resort. It's like, god damn it, I guess this has to be a poem.
I think a lot of the time, yeah, which like, I honestly love poems. I probably write way more poems than anything else. For some reason, I think often I try and assign something to like a short story. And I'm like, that idea does not work for a short story. This is a poem because it's either like more of a concept or more of just like a weird prolonged image or something like that. Or it's like a bunch of braided images where it almost feels like you're watching a trailer, but the trailer could never work as a story.
Okay, this just made me have a thought. It's like a trailer for a French movie.
Yes. They're like eating spaghetti and they're gay and you're like, okay, that's a poem.
I also like the idea that like both of us are like, a poem is probably the quickest, least time consuming thing to write. Last case scenario, I'll make it a poem.
I finally write a poem.
Because I love to suffer. I also find like it's usually just like one line that I have nothing else to do with. And it's like I normally won't even think about it that deeply. I'll just get a line and be like, that's a poem. Line.
Yeah, and it often feels like very premise-y. Like I feel like if you look at a lot of poems in collections, like Franny Choi's writing comes to mind, where like she clearly came up with a concept and then kind of went from there and figured out like, I'm going to explore, like in this stanza, I'm going to explore every aspect of this part of the concept, and then in the next stanza, I'm going to explore every aspect of the next part of the concept, kind of thing.
I like that.
I think, I don't know, that's just the way she does it, I think. Like, I think a lot of people do it in different ways, but I've noticed that she really like takes a premise and goes like, let's swing this way, and then we'll swing this way, and then we'll figure out some thoughts on the premise.
I do remember like the first time I read Franny Choi, who is like one of my favorite poets. I was like, oh my god, she has concepts to her poems. Like, I aspire for my poems to be about something.
No, I feel that. And that's like another thing I feel like with poetry is like so many, I don't know, when I'm talking to like other poets, like I'm talking to you or talking to anyone else from the program about poetry, a lot of the time we're like, what would our collection be about? And it's like, you don't really know until you've written enough poems that you kind of realize there's a thread through all of them. And usually it's not what you expected at all. And and it just happens at you.
Wrote a bunch of poems and I was like, none of these are about anything. I mean, except they're all about ghosts, but none of them are about anything.
But I've been thinking a lot about ghosts.
I really had been thinking about ghosts. I think I had other questions. I think you may have answered like 4 of them. Like the next one was, what does an idea for a poem look like or feel like as opposed to an idea for a fiction piece?
Oh yeah, I guess we did
French movie trailer. I don't know if there's more to say on that.
No, I think that's completely accurate, to be honest.
What do you look for when editing a poem? Like your own or I guess someone else's?
One of the things that you look for in like any writing would be like excess words that you don't need or ideas that don't really fit into the poem. Shaylin of course knows this about every story and every poem I've ever written. Tortures me every day, but there is always some like stanza or entire section or scene of the fiction
piece. Or like
piece
sometimes it's just like one line.
that has nothing to do with anything else that has been set up at all. Like I once had a fiction piece that was entirely about a girl living in a circus who was in love with another girl at the circus. And then there was like an entire conversation about trans rights. And trans rights, but it didn't need to be in that.
My favorite is the bees though. Sophie had a story where there was just one random line about how like they used, well, was it Notre Dame?
Oh yeah,
had, like
when Notre Dame burned like last year, a bunch of firefighters had to go save the bees because there were a bunch of bees on the roof of Notre Dame. But yeah, that was in a story that had nothing to do with Notre Dame or beehives in any regard. Super easy, especially if you're writing like a lyric poem, kind of like Richard Siken, Ocean Vuong like vibe, and you accidentally realize that like there's something in there that has nothing to do with anything else. That's a good thing to usually, like, I don't cut it, but I like, well, I do cut it, but I put it in like another document. Yeah. And like save it for later, because maybe it'll come up. Maybe you'll be talking about bees. So that's something I look for. I think also, this is something I've been like really thinking about a lot lately, but it's super easy to like get really wrapped up in your own poetry because it's so personal often and it's so emotional. I've been finding that sometimes a poem will get so personal that it's completely irrelevant to anyone who would be reading it, because you're doing like references to your own life. No one else can understand that. You're almost speaking in a language that only you understand, and that can be really beautiful if you're pulling it off. But if you're not pulling it off, you're just writing this poem that kind of like boxes out the reader, because it's like, I think the poet Phil Hall calls it being addicted. The poem is addicted to its own pain. And I've noticed that when I'm really angsty, sometimes I will write poems that are very addicted to their own pain. Like you can really tell that I was just going through it. And so there's no like moments of breath in the poem. There's no times that the poem kind of unclenches its fists and lets you in. It's always just the poem saying everything sucks, everything sucks, everything sucks. And like I looked at an old poem from when I was like having an angsty month a couple months ago, and it was just all of the stanzas, everything started with the word I, and everything was just like really down on itself to the point where I think it would alienate the reader. Not that you should be writing necessarily for the reader or for anyone specific, but just like remembering that not everyone is going to understand your pain unless you give them a way to understand it. You kind of have to form a dialogue or form some sort of language that you guys can use to communicate with each other, kind of thing. Whether that's like showing this beautiful image and then saying like, hey, look at this image. Now this one sentence about pain, do you feel that? Yeah, kind of like finding language to communicate with the reader or communicate even with yourself. Because if you write a poem and it lets you in on your own psyche better, probably it'll let the reader in on their own psyche better too. That's so good. Oh, thank you.
Anyway, so I'm giving the channel to you.
That's the only sentence that I have in my vocabulary.
Ever since quarantine started, which like also like, if this is a mess, we've been in quarantine for 2 months.
True, we are the only people that each other have seen pretty much for a while.
And I feel like ever since quarantine started, we've both been like, I don't know what words are.
Yep.
I forget how sentences work. This is like the most subjective question ever. So for you, like what is it makes a good poem? Even if it's not like all good poems have this.
Well, disclaimer, I don't know. Well, we both went to a Zoom lecture with Kaveh, Akbar,
So good.
praise, amazing writer, pretty recently. And he was talking, basically, the premise of the lecture was talking about how the English language, and I'm sure lots of you guys write in many different languages, and that's amazing and super helpful for writing. Love translation. So he was talking about how the English language is one of the like biggest colonial weapons and has caused so much damage, and that as writers we are kind of entrusting that insane weapon with ourselves. We're choosing to take that up and ideally not use it in any oppressive ways, and use it in fact in helpful ways that will make the world better, hopefully, although that's a lot of pressure to put on a poem. To that end, I would say a good poem uses language really carefully. I've heard this quote that like you can't really have a perfect novel because it's so long and there's so much to it, but you can have a perfect poem. I don't know that that's true. I certainly have not had a perfect poem yet. Maybe someday.
I'd argue Chicago Laundry.
Thank you. That is very sweet. Thank you.
Someday I will epigraph it. That is my goal.
Yeah, so I would say like really, really carefully chosen language where you can tell that every detail is really specifically chosen, especially because poems tend to be pretty short or like reasonably short. So probably you have the luxury of being able to be really, really, really careful about all of your words. With that, like ideally being compassionate and like thoughtful about how they affect others. So I'd say that's a big one. But also I would say like a good poem would be something where like I really love anyway, like poems where you don't necessarily get the simile from the author. Like you almost get to be the like or the as in the simile. Like they present an image and then they present a juxtaposed image or an unrelated image, and then they're trusting the reader to make that leap between like idea one, idea two, and almost put those together in their head. A lot of poets do that so brilliantly, and I love when there's an idea and there's another idea, and then I have to fit together what they mean to each other and almost like put them in a little like dialogue with each other. I love that. So
that's so cool.
Yeah. What about you? What do you think makes a good poem?
Obviously, like, this is not applicable to like all good poems, but I feel like a lot of poems that I really enjoy, you kind of get like, even though there's not a story, you almost get like the emotional, like the like same compressed emotional experience of reading like a whole novel in like one page, but like maybe just like the emotional arc of it, even if you're not experiencing like all the events. Yeah. Or like even know what all the events are.
I think like a lot of poetry profs will tell you like, ideally your poem starts in a different place than it ends in, or even if it is cyclical in some way, it at least brings you on a journey before it brings you back to the start kind of thing. So like that makes a lot of sense. Like you don't want the poem to feel like static. You want to like have this kind of like blooming feeling with the poem where you're like, oh, I have a realization.
Like, and like fiction does this sometimes too, but like on a line or imagery level, when you read a line and you're like, that's true, but I never thought about it. Yeah, you just like have that moment of like, oh, I really never thought about that before. Next question was, do you have any tips, practices, or exercises that you would recommend to new poets?
I think like I am someone who doesn't really write formal poetry very much, so that's like yep, like sonnets and ghazals. I took a whole class on
those to never do it again.
I don't really write them, and that's partially because like I feel like in a lot of ways they uphold what I kind of try to avoid about language. Like they kind of tend to uphold like more colonial and more like elitist versions of language. Because of like their history, I guess.
Kind of going back to like what we were saying about what makes a good poem. I really like a good poem that like feels like how it's thought. Kind of like the language imitates like a rhythm of thinking. And I feel like whenever, or not whenever, but like almost any time that I read a foreign poem, it doesn't feel like how I think. Like no part of my brain thinks in sonnets or like anything. And like if you do like cool bro, it feels kind of unnatural to me.
Yeah, like inauthentic a little bit.
Yeah, so it kind of removes what I like about poems.
That's so funny. I'm imagining like waking up with like a ghazal in your head. Good morning, everyone.
I feel like this is coming back to like that stupid, when we tried to like do for our screenplay project, like the passive aggressive haikuist, but it fully train wrecked. That's a story for another day.
Yeah, so I normally try to avoid formal poetry, but it can be a really good exercise especially when you're first starting. Like if you haven't written a poem ever, it can be an awesome way to get started. Like I used to think that poems always had to rhyme when I was younger, and now I know that they don't, and that's super helpful. But yeah, that's my arc. I guess like that was something that was kind of helpful sometimes anyway, is just like trying a form, because at least then you get out the thoughts, and then you can maybe, because I know you mentioned doing this before, like taking a formal poem and making it an informal poem, like basically, as a second draft.
Every single formal poem that I wrote for this class on poetry, which to my horror was all formal poetry. Some of them I hated, but the ones I didn't hate, I was like, cool, I'm gonna take this. Yeah. Make it a non-formal poem so I can get rid of all the parts that I hate that are only there because it's a formal poem and it has to be like that.
Yeah. I think like people who write formal poems are able to write them without like making it feel forced, but I can't do that. Maybe someday I'll be able to if I ever write another formal poem, which we'll see. But I do think it's a really helpful exercise, because it's almost like if you're a painter and you someday want to write, like want to paint really abstract, beautiful art, but it can, I'm sure, I'm not a painter, but I'm sure it would be helpful to first know how to draw a tree. And I think that's similar to like writing poetry. It can be really helpful to kind of learn the basics through formal poetry. I also think something I do often is take the poems of someone that I really, really respect and just kind of break it down like while I'm reading it, and notice where did they put like the verbs, where did they put the adjectives, where did they put the nouns, in what ways did they make the language a little bit weird, in what ways did they kind of invert the way you'd normally write a sentence, where are the sentence fragments versus where are like an actual like sentence, like do they use lists in a really cool way, that kind of stuff. And then just kind of remembering that when you're writing your own poetry, like what's the balance of the way they use words and how could you emulate that kind of thing, I guess.
I feel like maybe like if especially like mixing that with like trying like form poems, like it's good to like put constraints on yourself. I think that like makes you sometimes think about it
totally
more. If you wanted to do like a type of like found poem with like other poets, that would be like maybe a good way to do it. Like
super good.
I feel like one of the form poems that I learned the most from was doing a glossa, just because like I had to first of all read the poem that I was doing the glossa of like super carefully and really analyze it, but then also try to write my own poem that wouldn't feel jarring with the parts of that poem in it. Totally. And so I was like, I am Franny Choi. And then I finished the poem and I was like, wait, I'm not. But I kind of learned some things from her.
Yeah. Blackout poetry can be awesome too, like with magazines or like journals or newspapers. I love blackout poetry. It's just like super relaxing too if you just want to hang out and do blackout poetry. That's awesome. Centos, I think, is another one.
They seem so hard.
I think they're really hard. I've only done like one, I think, but
I've been really into prose poems lately because it's kind of like, I don't know how to write flash fiction and I also don't know how to write poetry, but a prose poem is kind of half of both, so I also don't really know how to write it, but here we go.
Practice for both.
But I found that like for almost like a lot of poems lately, I've been just writing as a prose poem first and then adding the line breaks. Ooh. And I feel like that has made my line breaks, like I've learned to use line breaks a lot better by starting them as prose poems. And sometimes it's like a prose poem, like it can just stay like that. But I feel like I've been better at line breaks since I've added them afterwards only. Yeah. Because then it's like you're just adding the line breaks instead of like being like in the process flow of writing the poem, just like throwing in line breaks everywhere.
Yeah. On the topic of line breaks, because we were also talking about this the other day, no one knows how to use them is pretty much, I think, the upshot. But also, it can really help if you read the poem out loud, because often the line breaks are where you would just pause if you were reading it at a reading, and that can be really helpful.
One thing I've been trying, like, thinking about a lot with line breaks lately, because I've noticed, like, Christian Chang does this with her line breaks a lot, and also I noticed it actually in Leslie's poem Plenitude. Oh, yeah. Where she had a moment like this, and I was like, my mind is blown, where it's like, the line break gives you multiple like levels of meaning to reading the same sentence. So like the like line on its own has a meaning, but then like when you read it within the poem it also has a meaning. In her poem it was like a woman is catching fire, and then like on the next line it was like flies, so altogether it was like a woman is catching fireflies like in her teeth or something. Yeah. But without the line break you could also read it as a woman is catching fire, and I was just like, her mind.
Yeah. And, oh, one other thing I just thought of is 2 exercises that my poetry prof gave us to do. One of them is, I think it's called M+7, where if you have a word in your poem that's like a little bit too on the nose and so it feels almost preachy or like you're telling the reader too much or being like really unsubtle, something you can do is find that word in the dictionary and then go 7 words or 7, like say it's a noun, go 7 nouns down and then use that noun instead. So it has like the same first letter and it might even have the same sound as that word, but it's a completely different word. So can lead to kind of more absurdist poetry, but also like really helpful just as a way of like playing with language. And then the other one that he has us do is doing a poem where each line is unrelated to the previous line in subject and location, and each one can only have one location, one verb, and one actor of the verb. And it's a really, really awesome way of learning to write more non-linearly and like...
Dude, that sounds hard.
It's really difficult. It definitely helps with like letting the reader make their own leaps, because the reader, like the way that people can like make faces when they see like raindrops on a window, your brain does the same thing with poetry pretty much. Like it's pareidolia, basically. I know that's like your favorite word. Brain will do the same thing with a poem, and so that poem is a super helpful one.
My next question, also feel free to roast me and my poetry, is what are some common mistakes that you think new poets make?
A common mistake is thinking that poems can't be fun.
I feel like people do that with short stories too.
Yeah.
Like they're like, it has to be about like, it has to have like a moral or like a philosophy. I'm like, bro, like, if you want to like write about like a dude who like has a boat pulled by dolphins, like
exactly,
do that.
Like
it doesn't, the dolphins don't need to be a metaphor for something.
A really common thing is people think it has to either be about like the majesty of the forest or like
very candid
heartbreak, or you know, in the abstract, not like a specific instance with like cool weird things about it, but just like the concept of heartbreak or something else like that, where it's like super serious. And like it doesn't like have to be at all. Like there's this one really awesome poem, it's called At Lunchtime. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's if you Google At Lunchtime poem, you'll find it. But it's about someone like loses their hat on a bus, and then while they're trying to find it, all of the people on the bus fall into each other, and then they just start having an orgy. And it's written in like really, really funny words. And like half of the words are squished together into new words, and it's amazing, but it's so fun. Like Aisha, Sasha, John has a poem that's entirely about going to buy tacos. And it's beautiful, and she's won all these awards for her poetry. So I think like putting a lot of pressure on poems, you know, and asking them to be everything, or asking them to like answer the questions of the world. Like so often I'll be writing a poem and I'll make the mistake of thinking that all of my lines have to sound like incredibly smart and philosophical. Yeah. But like they don't. And honestly, like you don't even need to have one incredibly smart and philosophical line in a poem. You can just have some thoughts and some images and things that happen in the world. And honestly, the reader is smart. They'll put together the pieces and figure something out.
And I feel like a lot of people also, like, because they like want their poetry to be like important, they like gravitate to like really abstract big concepts. Yeah. But then the poem's not really like actually about anything. Like if they're just like write a poem about heartbreak, but it's all like non-specific to like a person, and it's very like kind of vague because it's like that's what people think is important. Yeah. I completely that was so non-articulate.
Even when you're trying to talk about those concepts like largely and abstractly, like you were just doing, it's really, really hard to talk about large abstract concepts because they're not tied to anything really like in the real world. Yeah. Whereas it's so much easier to talk about like a weird interaction that you witnessed on the street or something like that, and not even really have a commentary about it. Like you don't have to. That often will come through just with the words or with the way you specifically observe it. It doesn't have to be like, and that's why I believe in God now or something. I'm not the arbiter of poetic mistakes. I make a lot of them, but that's like, I think the big one for me anyway. Yeah, I don't know. 2 of the like top tips that I've ever gotten about poetry.
So I need them.
One I got from this guy who was, who I knew in 3rd year, and I wasn't in poetry yet then. And he was honestly just mentioning it because he thought it was a bad piece of advice, but I actually loved it. Yeah, so like this guy gave me the advice, or kind of like generally put out the advice to start every poem with a location. Like root every poem in a location at the beginning. And I guess this doesn't go for every single poem, but root your poem in a location at the beginning of the poem, because then the reader has a visual and also kind of a context for the poem. And it can leave that location and go other places and go to other thoughts, but it can be super helpful just to have like that feeling of grounding for all of the ideas that come after. So that I find really helpful. Might not apply to every poem.
It is helpful though. I remember you mentioned that to me once, and like ever since I started thinking about that, I've always struggled to like write the beginning of poems.
Totally.
For some reason, and then like thinking of that, it's helpful.
Super helpful.
It's good stuff.
Yeah. Even if you just give it like a cool little spot it can be happening. It's like, oh, this is happening in a rhododendron patch, and then bam, awesome. Now everything happens there. And it also kind of gives you some themes that you can work with frequently. And the other piece of advice that I got, this was also from my prof. I have a hard time when I'm writing. I can kind of get didactic sometimes because I'll get this big political idea that I want to like get across to the reader, but that comes across super pedantic and super annoying, and no one wants to be lectured. They came here to read a cool poem, not because they wanted you to yell at them. So ideally, like, your poem is probably uncertain because you're just a person. I'm just a person. We're all just people. We are super uncertain of ourselves.
It's true.
None of us have the answers. So it can help to have your poem realize that it doesn't have the answers and like ask questions. Ask questions of itself, ask questions of the reader, whichever. And that really helps. Like when you're writing a poem, you're not presenting like a solved equation. You're writing out an unsolved like expression. You don't need to solve it by the end, you know? You don't need to have it tied up in a bow with like an answer or a moral. And in fact, I think it's often better if you don't. It definitely is so much more helpful if like your poem kind of ends not necessarily on a literal question mark, but with like some margin of uncertainty, because like the reader's smart, they'll figure it out. And also you want to leave some room for yourself to be uncertain, you know?
Yeah. I remember you like told that to me when I like first started writing poetry like a year ago. It was actually like really helpful because I feel like I was always worrying about like, oh, like what if I don't know what I'm saying? And so Sophie was like, yeah, you don't have to know what you're saying. The poem can know that it doesn't know what you're saying. The narrative voice, like whether it was like me or like adjacent to me, like felt a lot more like humanized and like empathetic when it like wasn't trying to be like, I know what I'm talking about. Because I don't, but like who does?
Yeah.
Like, literally no one.
I feel like it helps so much more if you're like writing the poem with a confident voice and like you have some sort of through line of ideas and, you know, themes and concepts and, you know, imagery, but the moral you don't need to know. And like so many of the poets that I know will write a poem and then be like, not sure what that was. Okay.
So my final question is just, do you have any poems or collections or poets that you'd recommend or have been enjoying lately?
Well, one of my like all-time favorites is Ocean Vuong. Obsessed with his work always. Yeah. Danez Smith is also
so good.
Amazing. They're so good. And then they also have a podcast on Poetry Foundation with Franny Choi, I believe.
They have every poet that I like on that podcast.
Literally.
It's incredible.
It's so
That's
good.
like how I found so many poets that I like. Yeah, like I remember like hearing like the episode with Kaveh Akbar like a long time ago. Yeah. And I was just like, must read his book. And now we've been in a Zoom call with him.
Which best moment of my life. Warsan Shire is like one of my favorites. I think she only has like 1 or 2 chapbooks out, but they're really good.
It's actually tragic.
Yeah.
That she doesn't have more out.
Aisha, Sasha, John is another favorite. We both love Richard Siken.
It's actually problematic.
Yeah.
Like it's fine.
But it's also an addiction.
But like it's a problem.
And we are seeking help, so don't worry. Kaveh Akbar's spouse, Paige Lewis, is incredible. I've only just gotten into their poetry, but it is like very transcendent. Everyone, I don't know.
Yeah.
I love poetry.
Yeah, also
super nice.
Abdurraqib.
So oh my god,
yes. I just remembered because we have this book right here.
It's
and
so
this
good.
Is so good. I'll say I definitely do feel like poetry definitely makes my fiction better. Like whenever I write a couple poems and then I go back to fiction, I'm like, who is she?
Yeah. Who's this?
Like, ooh, Like,
Yeah.
sorry, that word choice? Like,
Where did that come from? Was that a poem?
I've also like definitely noticed that like my like process is like when I forget how to write a novel, I write a short story. When I forget how to write a short story, I write a poem.
Yeah. When I forget how to write a poem, I
cry. Promote any things that you have.
I guess I'm on all social media. I'm Goblin Puck.
An icon.
Yeah, spelled like you'd expect. And I've got a couple of things out on the internet. They're in the bios of my social media, but I have some poem in Plenitude, and I have a short story in Nashville Review. Thank you.
Also so good.
Thank you.
About Yetis, except not actually, but like
except there are no real Yetis. But yeah, sorry about that. There should be Yetis, honestly.
Cool.
Thank you so much for having me. It was super fun.
Thank you for
always
being
love the
here.
videos.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here. Literally the most tendy thing that has happened in my life was that when you and Astra said that you read the comment sections of my videos to make sure that no one is being mean to me.
That is completely accurate.
I just like,
It's still, also Kaius does that.
yeah, but that's because Kaius was traumatized by that one.
Yeah, we all
God.
were. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, whoever you are who left that comment about foxes, like, absolute nightmare fuel for myself and all my friends. That messed us up. That's all I have to say for this video, and I'll see you guys next time.